On the 10th of October, 1884, John III and his brother David had their names read over the pulpit in General Conference in Salt Lake City, calling them both to serve missions in the Swiss-German mission for 2 years. They both accepted that call, and on October 24th, they said goodbye to their families and left for Switzerland without purse or script. They were joined in Ovid by Brother Conrad Botterless, who had been called to the same mission. Both John and David served honorable missions. John and David both left their daily missionary journals for their posterities, which have been typed and are available from the right people. John, while in Berlin, received a farewell letter from David on August the 25th, as David was called as the captain of a company of immigrants coming to Zion aboard the SS Wyoming with Elder Thomas Slight and Elder Anderson as his counselors. John received another letter from David on September 12th announcing the safe arrival of his company and the SS Wyoming in New York. John had not been released as of that date. David was back in Bear Lake in early September of 1886. Both John and David still had interest in the Kunz Dairies at Bern, and both still had family members working at the dairy. Both had homes and farms and families in Bern, and both were regrouping their lives and were continuing on in the dairy business. David was a large man at 5 foot 10 inches tall and weighing 205 pounds. He had big blue eyes and a beautiful sorely beard. While David was on his mission, he was having serious health issues. Serious enough that Carl Schmid said they should release David before they had to send him home in a box. David remained and continued to serve honorably and was finally released after 22 months of service. The presiding elder released David 2 months early because of his failing health. 6 years before David left on his mission to Switzerland, he married on October 9, 1878, Louise Jacob at age 21, David being age 23, as his first wife in the old endowment house in Salt Lake City, and moved her to Bern with a log house with a dirt roof where she started her family. 6 years after Louise married David, he was called to serve for 2 years in the Swiss-German mission, leaving her in Bern with 2 small children to care for, plus milking cows and helping at the dairy as time would permit. David and Louise had previously buried 1 son by this time. We should say a little about Louise Jacob, or Aunt Lou as she was commonly called in Bern. Aunt Lou was born May 14, 1857, in St. Eimer, Switzerland. The first part of April 1862, she with her folks left Switzerland for Zion. Louise was a month short of 5 years when they left Switzerland, and was 5 years old when they arrived in Logan. Lou's dad was a carpenter by trade and brought all his tools with him from Switzerland. Louise tells that when fire broke out on the ship, a sailor dropped her through a hole in the floor in the room below for her safety, and when the fire was out, they came and retrieved her. The fire disabled the ship, and they drifted for over a week before they finished the repairs and were able to get underway again. Because of the delay, they ran out of food on the ship and spent a number of hungry days before relief came in the way of food. Aunt Lou, as a little girl while aboard ship, witnessed a burial at sea which haunted her for years. When they arrived in New York, they were still facing the trip to Salt Lake by handcart. When it was discovered that their trunks of belongings would not fit on a handcart, Nicholas Jacob bought an ox and half a wagon, and another bought an ox and half a wagon, and together they were able to take their belongings. The family joined the William H. Dame Company wagon train of 1862 and started for Utah. Often when Aunt Lou got tired at age 4 from walking, she was allowed to ride on the ox. Louise relates that at times her father would go ahead to hunt animals for food. He took Lou with him on one of those trips, and in putting her down he instructed her to stay and wait for him, and she pursued him almost to the top of a hill before falling down and rolling back down. Her screaming brought her father, and that was the last time she was allowed to go ahead with him. During that trip, a baby was born to her mother and lived only a few hours. They laid over a day, buried the baby, and had to travel more slowly because of her mother's condition. In early October, they reached the mountains and were caught in an early snowstorm that dumped 6 feet. The company was stranded for a time. They were able to collect enough firewood to stay alive, but they did run out of food. Lou remembers the night the relief party arrived, and she was awakened by people shouting, "Biscuits, biscuits." When they arrived in Salt Lake City, Louise could speak the English language quite well. They shortly moved to Logan, and her father built the first frame house in Logan. He was a carpenter, and having brought his tools from the old country, he soon built more to make his living. Louise remembers that her shoes were wore out crossing the plains, but she had a new pair in one of the trunks, so her little friends thought she was rich. Her father made her a pair of wooden shoes like the other children wore to save her new ones. Nicholas Jacob, Louise's father, helped build the Logan Temple, and it was he, through sleepless nights, designed and built the winding stairway in the Logan Temple. In fact, David and Louise were in Logan visiting Aunt Lou's folks at the time of David's call when he received word from John in Bern. Now that David's mission was over and he and Louise were once again reunited in Bern and busy at the dairy, that would have been from September of 1886 until the fall of 1888. It was during this time that David and Louise got their 4th child and 3rd son. Ezra Louis Kunz was born August 14, 1887, in Bern, Idaho. The pressing problem of diminishing open range became a serious concern that was being discussed for resolution between the Kunz brothers. In the spring of 1888, Samuel and William had moved their cheese-making operations to Williamsburg and had staked claims on both the lower and middle dairies. It appears from entries in journals and histories that John III and David moved out to Williamsburg and staked claims for the upper dairy and Dave's place in the spring of 1889. Foster records in his history that his grandfather Robert Kunz, as a young man, had gone to the Williamsburg area and brought back reports about this beautiful mountain country, which was so well adapted for grazing large numbers of stock. Some records say that Samuel and Sammy Jr. had been in the Williamsburg area as well before finally moving there and had brought back similar favorable reports. During this time, David and Louise were working in the dairy at Bern with John II and William J. and Johnny and some of his brothers and also some hired young women to help with the making of the cheese. One of those young women working at the dairy was 18-year-old Sophie Nielsen, daughter of Hans L. Nielsen and Karen Kirsten of Mink Creek, Idaho. Rebecca Kunz Bueller says in her biography of David Kunz, her father, that one of those hired girls, Sophia Nielsen, soon became a favorite of the Kunz family. Aunt Lou, David's first wife, liked her very much. On October 27, 1888, Father married Maren Sophia Nielsen, who was my mother. They were married secretly, and Aunt Lou was the only person that knew about the wedding, and she was much in favor of it. From David's return in 1886 to his marriage in October of 1888, David had also made trips to Williamsburg exploring the possibility and feasibility of dairying in that country. Robert Schmidt indicates in his journal that prior to himself, William J., and Johnny moving to the Middle Dairy in 1892, David had also located on what was known as Dave's Creek, a mile below Sam's Place or the Lower Dairy. Rebecca Kunz Bueller states in her biography of David that father and mother, that would have been Sophia Nielsen, moved to Williamsburg and made cheese during the summers, the first few years after their marriage. Let's here give a brief account of the history of Maren Sophia Nielsen, David's second wife. Marian Sophia Nielsen was the fourth child and second daughter of Hans L. Nielsen and Karen Kirsten Hansen. Hans and Karen were married February 9, 1858, both aged 22 by the laws of Denmark. There were 5 children in the Hans L. Nielsen and Karen Kirsten Hansen family. Annie Marie, born August 9, 1860, was the oldest. Then there was a son, Jens Peter, born April 11, 1863. Jens became James in America. Then came a second son, Lars, born on October the 6th, 1866. Then came Sophia, that would be David's second wife, born the 18th of April, 1869, in Tvesk, Denmark. There was one last daughter, Hannie Christine, born November 8, 1871. On December 18, 1872, Hans and Karen and their 2 oldest children were baptized into the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. The 3 younger children were too young to be baptized. The persecution of the saints was extreme at that time in Denmark, so in months Hans and Karen had decided to emigrate. Hans's mother, Maren Catherine, was most adamantly opposed to their joining the Mormons and their plans to emigrate. It came time to leave, and the family had boarded the ship to set sail the next morning. Marian conceived a plan that she thought would keep Hans and his family in Denmark. She went aboard the ship and convinced Hans and Karen to let their oldest daughter, Annie Marie, go home with her and spend one last night with her grandmother. She assured them that she would have the girl back well before the ship was to sail the next morning. Grandmother Marian convinced Hans, and she took Annie Marie with her, and then convinced Annie that if she hid, the family would not sail without her and they would stay in Denmark. Marian hid Annie Marie in a neighbor's closet where she remained for 3 days. When Marian did not show up with Annie Marie the next morning, Hans left the ship and went looking for her. Hans had a confrontation with his mother concerning the whereabouts of Annie Marie, and when he was convinced his mother would not tell him where she was, he went to the law to file kidnapping charges, but he did not have the required paperwork to prove Annie Marie was his daughter, as those papers were packed on the ship. Hans failed in his attempt to retrieve his daughter, and he barely made it back to the ship in time to board with his family to sail to America. Annie Marie was left behind in Denmark. At the time of sailing, Sophia was just 4 years old. After the ship sailed, Marion had to explain to Annie Marie that her plan had failed and her family had sailed without her. Hans and Karen did correspond with Annie Marie after they landed in America. Additional information on this incident obtained from Becky Williams, which came from Sophia Rebecca Kunz Bueller's 1978 history, tells that the 1870 Danish census shows that Annie Marie was living with her grandmother as a foster child 3 years before the family joined the church and decided to emigrate. The history says so she could attend school, as the school was much closer to her grandparents' home than that of her parents. When the time for the family to immigrate came, Hans went to get his daughter, and grandmother Marion Katrine would not let her go, and when Hans tried to take her by force, his brothers confronted him with pitchforks and threatened him if he did not leave her be. Hans then went to the law for help, and their answer to him was that she has it good enough where she is, and gave him no help. Then, because of time, Hans rushed back to the ship to join his family and set sail without Annie Marie. Hans did correspond with Annie Marie from America, and he did offer to send her passage to join the family in Utah. But for whatever reason, Annie Marie was content with her situation, and even though one of her brothers and a cousin made contact with her in Denmark years later while serving missions, she stayed in Denmark and had no interest in the church. When Annie Marie was confirmed into the Lutheran Church in 1874, a year after her family immigrated, the confirmation certificate states that her father was in America. Annie Marie married, raised a family, and died in Denmark without ever seeing her folks again. Becky Williams is a daughter of Calvin Bueller, a granddaughter of Sophia Rebecca Kunz Bueller, and a great-granddaughter of David Kunz and Sophia Nielsen. She has given me access to much of the David and Sophia family history in her keeping. In 1903, 30 years later, Jens Peter returned to Denmark on a proselyting mission and made friends with Annie Marie, but was never able to convince her to have anything to do with the church. Hans and Karen never saw their daughter again in this life. This separation of Annie Marie and her mother Karen was so hard on Karen that it broke her health, and she never recovered her health. Hans and Karen and their family sailed for America in the spring of 1873, and Karen died October 7, 1874, at age 39, about 18 months after immigrating. After reaching Ogden by train, Hans and Karen and their family settled in what was called Little Valley, or now known as Manawa, just above Brigham City. So in Manawa, Hans and Karen began pioneer life by building a cabin and planting crops. Hans had managed to bring with him from Denmark, from the sale of his property, the sum of $500, which he was convinced by the local store owner in Manawa to allow him to put in his safe for safekeeping, with the assurance that it would be available to Hans as he may need it. Hans found peace of mind in this, but when he needed some of the money and went to get it, the store owner denied any knowledge of the money, and Hans never recovered any of his money. While the family was in Manawa, Karen delivered her last baby, a boy named Hans Joseph, on October 28, 1873. The delivery of and the caring for Hans Joseph added additional strain on Karen's health. Because of Karen's continuing health failure, Hans felt an urgency to take Karen and his family, including Sophia, to the endowment house in Salt Lake City and have Karen sealed to him and the family sealed to them. So he did on September 14, 1874. Because of Karen's health, Hans hired a young woman who had immigrated in the same company with the family from Denmark to assist Karen with the work of caring for the children. Her name was Annie Christine, sometimes referred to as Anna Christina. Karen, knowing she was about to die, made Annie Christina promise that when she passed, she, Annie, would take care of the children, which she promised to do. Karen died October 7, 1874, and Annie Christine, age 17, married Hans, age 39, on November 16, 1874, about 5 weeks later in the endowment house in Salt Lake City, to fulfill that promise to Karen. Sophia, at 6½ had a new stepmother. By the end of the summer of 1875, Hans was prepared to move his family to Mink Creek for more room and more land, which 2 other families living in Manawa had done several years previous. By summer's end, 1875, Hans was prepared to move his family to Mink Creek, some 60 miles to the north end of Cache Valley in the Idaho Territory. At the time of this move, in 1875, Lars, Sophia's brother, was 8 years old. Lars was to start going early in the day leading the cow, and Hans was finishing some business and would catch up shortly. Right after Lars and the cow left for Mink Creek, the threshing crew showed up, and Hans was delayed until the next morning. When evening came, Lars prepared to retire for the night. Before laying down to sleep, he tied the cow's lead rope to his ankle so she would not wander off. The next day, Hans overtook Lars and the cow. Lars led the cow and walked the full 60 miles. Hans moved the family and their possessions in a wagon. Hans and Annie were the 3rd family to move to Mink Creek. They lived in that wagon for a number of weeks while they were building their cabin. They had only moved in when Annie Christine gave birth to her first and Hans's 7th child on November 19, 1875. She was named Olga Christina. She was the 2nd birth in Mink Creek and died several days later, and was the first death in Mink Creek. She was the first burial in the current Mink Creek Cemetery. The Nielsens were the 3rd family to locate in Mink Creek. Hans's testimony was pushed to the limits by the trials he endured. But once the family was settled in Mink Creek, and he and Annie were adding to their family, and they were actively busy in the Mink Creek ward, his testimony again becomes solid upon a sure foundation. And so also grew the testimonies of their children. The Hans Nielsen family had been living in Mink Creek for 11 or 12 years when young Sophia Nielsen went to work for the Kunz Dairy in Bern. Months after starting working for the Kunzes, Sophia, at age 19, married David Kunz as his second wife on the 27th of October, 1888, in the old endowment house in Salt Lake City. In the spring of 1889, David and Sophia moved to Dave's place in Williamsburg and made cheese for the summers. They did this for a number of years after their marriage. David is credited for raising the first grain in Bern in Uncle George's History of Bern. He says that John II and David plowed 10 acres below Cemetery Hill with horses or oxen and a hand plow. When it was ripe, it was cut with scythes and threshed with flails. There is no date for the planting or harvesting of this crop. Robert, David's brother, also raised a crop of grain near his father's house, which he lived in at about the same time. When David built his dairy in Williamsburg starting in 1888 and 1889, he and Aunt Lou's oldest boy, David J., was only 9 years old. Lula Rosina was only 6, and Ezra Louis was barely 2. David and Sophia, being just married, had no children. When David and Sophia moved to Williamsburg to build that dairy in the spring of 1889, they did not have a large family with older children to help with this endeavor. Sophia was 6 months pregnant with her first child, a daughter, Mabel Christina Kunz, born August 15, 1889, in Mink Creek. So apparently sometime before that birth, Sophia left Williamsburg and traveled to Mink Creek to her folks' home for that delivery. They appear to have built Dave's dairy in Williamsburg basically alone, except for the occasional family member or hired individuals. During the first year or two, corrals had to be built, and a living quarters, a drying building, milk cooling facility, and a cheese house, plus milking cows and the making of cheese. This was a big undertaking. Robert Smith indicates in his journal that prior to himself and William J. and Johnny moving to the Middle Dairy in the spring of 1892, Dave had already located on what was known as Dave's Creek, a mile below Sam's place or the Lower Dairy. Rebecca Kuntz Bueller states in her biography of David that father and mother, Rebecca's mother was Sophia Nielsen, moved to Williamsburg and made cheese during the summers, the first few years after their marriage in October of 1888. Again, Robert Schmid writes in his journal, dated September of 1894, "Father and I went out to Lanes Creek. We camped at the Will Skinner place on Slug Creek. It snowed that night. I think it was about September 4th, 5th, or 6th. It snowed about 6 inches. I got stuck in the big spring north of the old South Beaver Dam in the Woolly Valley, and we just couldn't get out, so we decided to ride our horses up to the dairy." This was the first time in Father's life he had ever rode a horse. He was ready to dismount when we got to Dave Kuntz's dairy. Aunt Sophia was there and gave us a good supper. I remember that Aunt Sophia had a good bowl of Danish meat soup for us, which tasted delicious to us. From there we went to Will and Johnny's place, which would have been the Middle Dairy. When Robert and Carl Schmid stopped at Dave's Williamsburg dairy in early September of 1894, David and Sophia had 3 small children, ages 5 and 2.5, and a few months over 1. Sophia was at this time 7 months pregnant with her 4th child, a son that they named Guy, born November 23, 1894, and only lived a month before he died. We know from this entry in Robert's journal that David and Sophia were operating their Williamsburg dairy in the year of 1894. Another entry in Robert Schmidt's journal, dated under the year of 1895, says, "One day while Uncle David Kunz was cleaning a gun, a Winchester rifle, had a shell in it lodged, and while manipulating the gun it went off and blew part of his hand off. He had a sore hand for weeks, and of course was never the same." Sophia Rebecca talks about the exploding rifle incident in her history. She was at Williamsburg